Right, good afternoon everyone, hope everyone's doing well. Now, I have done one video previous to this, but I'm going to be uploading this one first since people are more interested in the politics rather than the book. But this will always be there, of course, for those who want to see it. Please forgive me, I have been playing a ton of Balatro, and I still am now to some degree, because this game is highly fucking addicting. Basically, make poker hands and score enough points to beat the blinds, and as it were. It might make a good little medium for the gambling issue I have. Who knows? But I digress. That's not why you're here. So, let's get this British Gas fucking envelope out of here. I'm going to quickly grab a drink so I don't die of dehydration. I know I'm over-exaggerating, but you know what... Oh, sorry, but you know what I mean. Accidental pause there. And then we'll get this started. Okay, so let's get the show on the road now. In our time, all the oligarchy have to do is trigger the gramophone mind of the phrase slaves. Tell them that a book criticising fanatical violence is a book of hate speech, and the sheep will bleat, "I am glad Muhammad's Quran was banned. It was hate speech." After the next Islamic terrorist attack, the very same people will turn around and say, "You must respect the Quran, because Islam is the religion of peace." Doublethink. Meanwhile, the leftist anti-fascist organisations, because my mind's going off on a tangent, unite against fascism, hope not hate, rather hate not hope, Antifa, in the pay as the fascist state, nearly had my first stroke there, pretend to be against violence and hatred when the fathers of their movement, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Mussolini, not only promoted violent class war of communism, but also promoted genocide and terrorism. Trotsky literally wrote a book advocating terrorism. See, for example, Chapter 4 of Trotsky's 1921 book, The Defense of Terrorism. The genocidal terrorist publications approved by the oligarchy, the justification for violence by communists and Muslims, are never subject to censorship. Trotsky's book, advocating leftist terrorism, is for sale by Amazon and published today by one of the world's leading publishers. Yet, our book, denouncing terrorism, is banned. But of course, the mainstream media won't tell you this. You know the drill, folks, because say it with me, it doesn't suit the narrative. Sorry, I had to get that in there. Anyway, some animals are more equal than others. Trotsky's book advocating terrorism was published in English in 1921 in London by the Labour Publishing Company. The translator of Trotsky's terrorism book was made the editor of the Labour Party newspaper the year after he published a book advocating terrorism. Remember that the next time Britain's Labour Party say that criticising one of the fascist state mascots is terrorism. In the wake of the riots in the UK in August 2024, the Southport riots, the crypto-fascist state broadcaster said that those who commented on the riots online would be prosecuted for terrorism. Sounds about right, doesn't it? Anywho, the foundational text of Islam, which advocates terrorist violence, is protected and praised. There are thousands of Trotskyists employed by the state, academics, council workers, trade union leaders, even medical doctors. The terrorist doctrines of groups allied with the fascist state are protected. The oligarchy control publishing. In our day, the oligarchy control social media and even the entire internet, as evidenced by the unspoken banning of Russian news across websites across the UK and the EU. Perhaps the most sinister example of thought control by the oligarchy, though, is what happens in compulsory, taxpayer-funded, state-controlled education. Of course, most of what is taught in schools is useless to the children. It's just a question of what pointless subjects to keep them occupied. Almost nothing of any value to most of them will be taught apart from mathematics and English. With every subject taught in school, the majority of students will have forgotten virtually everything. Fucking hell, I'm really fighting these strokes today. Everything they were taught within a few years of leaving school. Perhaps the single most useful subject taught at schools is mathematics. Stroke number one. I had to open my big fucking mouth, didn't I? Taught at schools is mathematics. But why and how the most various mathematical techniques are useful and important is never taught to the pupils. In recent tests of adults in Britain, just 6% could get the correct answer to 5 questions in mathematics on which they are examined at the age of 16. After they had 11 years of mathematics tuition at school, almost twice as many of those sampled did not get a single correct answer. If this applies to something as useful as mathematics, even when the vast majority of people are not taught why it is useful, how much more does this apply to all the other subjects? Who remembers 10% of what they are taught in history, geography, etc., etc.? Yet there are many truly useful subjects which could be taught. Car mechanics, the basics of contract law, the basics of criminal law, home maintenance, exercise, physiology, nutrition, etc., etc. It's clear that the purpose of education is nothing to do with enabling the child to cope for themselves as an adult. So schooling is just another of the pointless time-filling distractions promoted by the oligarchy. Distraction is itself a form of thought control. Your thinking is on the distraction, not on something more important. Remember, for more than 2,000 years, now I can't even fucking read. Good God. Those with power have used bread and circuses to distract the masses. Worse than this is the propaganda in schools. One of the most obvious forms of this is the transgender ideology. Remember, there are only 2 genders. With the result in a school of 450 children, some 60 or so say they are transgender, when even the number of gay people in society is truly no more than 1%. Things like drag queen story time is the state sowing gender confusion in small children, while a man with a penis and a beard is allowed into women's only spaces. A man can't have his birth certificate changed when he is in his 60s, but he feels he is in his 40s. This was a real legal case, apparently. Don't take my word for it, it says it in the fucking book. But I digress. The fascist state's support of gender confusion is the deliberate policy. A 30-year-old woman would not be allowed to identify as a 70-year-old to receive the welfare benefits of a pensioner, even though age and race are graduations. But biological sex is either male or female, except in extremely rare cases. If a school taught from the texts of Islam, such as teaching the pupils that Quran 9.5, kill the unbelievers, is the most pivotal verse in the whole doctrine of Islam, the school would be shut down by the state, and the teachers held responsible might even be jailed. Telling the truth in education is prohibited by the state, but sowing lies about biological sex is funded and protected by the state. This policy of gender confusion might seem like it's just leftist teachers being allowed to get on with their own kinky fetishes. Stroke number 2, their kinky fetishes, or however it's pronounced. As Orwell says in 1984, Inc. Soc coerces the masses to conform into believing nonsense. The so-called laws of nature were nonsense. The law of gravity was nonsense. If the public can be made to believe that a man with a beard is a woman, that the doctrines inspiring 1,400 years of terrorism are the religion of peace, then the public can be kept believing the lies of the oligarchy. But being ruled by the 1% is the best democracy in history, that Britain has always been multicultural, etc., etc. The organisation of state indoctrination in schools can be clearly demonstrated. It'll be no surprise that as a matter of routine, schools are lying to children about Islam. Schools won't tell them what the doctrines of Islam say, such as the many variants of kill the unbelievers in the Quran, or that the history of Islam across the world for 1,400 years have shown Muslims implementing these doctrines. The truth is forbidden. Instead, the children, the future victims of Islam, are told Islam is a religion of peace, with the typical distortions of the texts in order to pull off this deception. The history of jihad and enslavement by Muslims isn't taught. Such slavery going on right up until today, enabled in Libya by the leftist oligarchy in the West. The only slavery children will learn about in schools is white man bad. Of course, to the extent that white Britons had any involvement in slavery or the British Empire, it was only the oligarchy who were controlling and profiting from it, but the leftists used this racist sleight of hand, or however you want to pronounce it, to demoralise and disarm an entire nation of innocent people. The organised deception in schools is far more sinister than this. The leftist newspaper, The Guardian, had a column with the byline of Secret Teacher, where anonymous teachers would detail anything or things that went on in British schools. If the oligarchy had any problem with what was published in the billionaire-funded The Guardian, you can be sure the item would not appear. The Secret Teacher had this to say about what happens after terrorist attacks by Muslims, and I quote, "After each major terrorist attack in the UK, the safeguarding officer at our school meets with safeguarding leaders at the other local schools, as well as the police and local religious leaders. They then brief us on the facts of the attack and talk us through the key messages that we are to share with the students. Namely, how the attacks are actually un-Islamic, sometimes with specific reference to parts of the Quran, to demonstrate how the attackers have directly contravened the peaceful message of Islam. It's important that students receive this alternative message." End quote. Emphasis added. Notice the implicit admission by the leftist Guardian and the network of propagandists in schools. Each major terrorist attack in Britain is by the 6.5% of the population who are Muslims. Either that small population are inspired to terrorism, or there are more than 6.5% of the population which we think both statements are true. Muslims put Islam into practice by killing the mercenaries of the oligarchy, jump to gaslight the population victimised by the terrorists. So when Muslims in Britain literally follow the jihadist behaviour of the founder of Islam and his immediate disciples, the oligarchy has organised its mercenaries to leap into coordinated indoctrination of school children. The state-funded safeguarding officer meets with the other designated propagandists, with the police and Muslim leaders, the people employed by state-funded mosques. Their aim is to find ways to distort the text and history of Islam so that the school children are left deceived and unwarned by the shocking events that have just happened in their own society. The oligarchy deploys the phrase slavery to steer the children into the gramophone mines. The mercenaries of the oligarchy freely confess to what is going on in their billionaire-funded leftist stroke number 3, their leftist quality news site, safe in the knowledge that most of those who read this will approve of this deception in schools, posing as it does as education. This kind of organised deception by agents of the state will be going on in every school. As the secret teacher goes on to proudly state, and again I quote, "Now when there's a terrorist attack, it's the Muslim children in our classes who are the first to speak out, condemning the attacks, rather than receiving their opinions from the teachers. And the non-Muslim students are right by their side, confident in articulating their support with the Muslim community and aware of the negative impact such attacks can have on social perceptions of Islam." End quote. The mercenaries of the oligarchy collude with those Muslims who have memorized the Quran, those Muslims who know the fundamental importance of the Quran's commands to kill the unbelievers. That would have been a very easy place to have a stroke in, no less. The mercenaries do this to feed Muslim kids the sophisticated tools of deception so that the non-Muslim victims of Islam can be led to the slaughter, deceived by their Muslim peers. And this is being done during the 11 years of taxpayer-funded compulsory statist education. The teachers are the propagandist pig squealer of Animal Farm, lying about reality to the young farmed animals. A few years ago, one of these squealers had just retired from teaching. She was complaining over and over, "I spent my entire adult life indoctrinating and lying to children." She was a dyed-in-the-wool, politically correct, paid-up member of the Labour Party. When the kuffar, the unbelievers, are killed in accordance with the doctrines and history of Islam, the state-funded squealer's main concern is, as the article explicitly says, the social perceptions of Islam. This is gaslighting masquerading as taxpayer-funded education. Your taxes are used to lead your own children to be slaughtered. This industrial-scale indoctrination was also invoked in the wake of the 2024 riots against mass immigration. The schools were reportedly going to train children to dismiss anything except oligarchy propaganda as fake news. Children to be taught how to spot extremist content and fake news online. But the same kids will be brainwashed that the Quran's stroke number 4. We are really not doing well. We're a stroke every 4 minutes. Christ almighty. The kids will be brainwashed that the Quran's commands to kill the unbelievers and the history of Islamic slaughter of non-Muslims is the religion of peace. As Huxley says in the quotation at the start of our book, we must begin without delay to educate ourselves and our children. Appendix 12, Muhammad's Wars, is all anyone really needs in order to understand Islamic terrorism. The indoctrination is far more pervasive than just what is going on in schools. So-called artificial intelligence has been programmed to only give politically correct, woke responses exposed when it shows SS officers as Africans. There are many questions where the AI will either refuse to answer a question, or it will lie, or it will wrap each answer, this is the right page, in woke moralizing. This is the clearest possible example that the oligarchy are always involved in thought control. They cannot permit even machine intelligence to regurgitate facts. It would serve people well to start accumulating physical books while they still can. AI is trained on massive amounts of social media posts, contents which have been made politically correct by the policies of the fascist state and the woke corporations, so that the AI knows that a non-Muslim saying Islam causes terrorism is classed as hate speech. But a Muslim quoting Quran's 9:5, kill the unbelievers, is acceptable under the two-tier rules of hate speech. A Muslim is allowed to cite approvingly Islam's misogyny towards women, but a non-Muslim who criticizes the Islamic morality of mutilating the genitals of little girls is involved in hate speech, or FGM, basically. As time progresses, AI tools will be used to report things that you say on social media directly to the police. Even those people who are not saying anything that gets them reported to the police are constantly programmed, propagandized, brainwashed by stroke number 5. My God, brainwashed by the contradictions of what content is acceptable on social media. God, I'm really getting worried for my health now. The more time you spend on social media, the more you will come to believe all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Since Britain's Liberal Democratic government think that the reading of Orwell's 1984 is a sign of far-right white supremacism, we should pay attention to what Orwell said, like Aldous Huxley. Orwell had been a Fabian, so he knew what were the Fabians' plans implemented by the political parties they control. The party taught that the proles were natural inferiors who must be kept in subjection, like animals, by the application of a few simple rules: heavy physical work, the care of home and children, petty quarrels with neighbours, films, football, beer, and above all, gambling. filled up the horizons of their minds. Well, we all know what one got me, that's for fucking sure. But I digress. To keep them all in control was not difficult. A few agents of the thought police moved always among them, spreading false rumours and marking down and eliminating the few individuals who were judged capable of becoming dangerous. But no attempt was made to indoctrinate them with the ideology of the party. It was not desirable that the probe should have strong political feelings. All that was required of them was a primitive patriotism which could be appealed to whenever it was necessary to make them accept longer working hours or shorter rations. Orwell showed that the oligarchy, with their project of Fabian socialism, INGSOC, know how to keep the despised lower classes busy and entertained, to use monitoring and agent provocateurs to spread fear and doubt, eliminating those few who stood up against the elite. And the oligarchy used wars to distract from economic problems that the masses cannot help but notice. And after the wars, socialism and social control have been further advanced. Now, we move on to we now move on to 3.11, journalists and the media. But first, I'm going to put the heating on. My hands are fucking freezing. Right. So, we've seen how as long ago as 1908, Jack London explained the mechanism by which the newspapers suppressed information, or distorted events to keep the public in phrase slavery. We've seen how even an accomplished mainstream author like George Orwell could have fairy stories suppressed when it exposed how the Bolshevik Revolution became an oligarchy. In reality, Animal Farm exposes how the oligarchy function everywhere. Orwell and London might seem like two oddball leftist authors. So let us turn to how the prominent but still left-wing academics in the last 50 years of the 20th century analysed how newspapers and broadcasting work. We will see later how these same mechanisms are being used on the internet to control speech and thus control thought. In a nutshell, this summarises the prevailing view among the leftist academics. Ideology also has much to do with setting the news agenda. Oh, this is an air quote, by the way. Determining what qualifies as news, end quote. As we have seen in England, with Muslim grooming gangs systematically pimping out English schoolgirls, the news media ignored it for decades. Moreover, once the English Defence League appeared and protested, within a couple of years, the news media, in obvious collusion with the government, decided not even to report on any of the criminal trials of these child pists until the trial was over. In this way, the oligarchy could ensure that the public continued to be kept in the dark about the scale of this criminality going on from the 1970s to the current day. In the 1970s and 80s, a group of leftist sociologists at Glasgow University made analysing how the news media works in a major project. In short, this was their view, and I quote, "The media mediates, which means they select and edit, dramatising some and repressing other events according to their own standards and rules. They stand between the public on the one side and on the other, the official managers of institutions, organisations, movements, or the society's hegemonic elites. Media develop their own machinery and rules for generating convincing accounts of social reality and what is worth featuring or reporting at all." End quote. You see that the left at the end of the 20th century were aware of how the elite distort reality, just as school teachers nowadays have complex mechanisms for gaslighting school children. It's curious that, as with Michaels, it's the hated subject of sociology that set about this kind of media analysis. As the oligarchy proceeded to co-opt as mascots the mascots of leftist identity politics, sociology was effectively neutered as opposition to the oligarchy. But if these leftist academics had ever been any real threat to the oligarchy, they would have not been able to publish at all. After all, Orwell was more famous than them, but he couldn't get publishers to take Animal Farm. And in the last 25 years, we have seen how academics and publishers have chosen to suppress any books by the victims of Islam which tell the truth about Islam. By 2004, the Glasgow Media Group, GMG, had given up on reporting on elite manipulation of news in Britain and had taken to the writing of books about Israel and Venezuela. Strangely, in the 40 years in which this leftist group of academics were operating, they never wrote a book on how the news media cover up the industrial scale of working-class schoolgirls. One of the leaders of GMG had been a professor in the highly Islamized town of Bradford. These leftists ended up as professors, and so members of the oligarchy. Yeah, it's no surprise some of them would go on to write about Islamophobia, which is just a made-up word, basically, to suppress free speech and what have you. Anyway, rather than the organised groups of Muslim immigrants systematically ping schoolgirls, these brave academics know what issues will damage their personal safety and what will propel their academic career. If they had exposed the cover-up of the gangs, their careers would have been over, just like that. The system of middle-class professions is one of the ways by which the oligarchy exerts control. We will see below the leftist case for how the oligarchy set the news agenda in broadcasting. But first, let's turn the clock back to the 19th century Britain and show how the oligarchy set about destroying dissenting opinions in that century. Trust us. The relevance of this will be seen when we turn to the control of broadcasting in the 20th century and the control of the internet in the 21st century. The pattern of thought control is the same. Once the Gutenberg printing presses was invented in 1450, and the religious revolution is brought to Europe, Protestantism, nearly butchered that, from 1517, in the centuries that followed, the oligarchy feared the public being able to assert their own views on the limbs of the elephant, views that were not in favour of the controlling elite. In 19th century Britain, this was stroke number 6. This led to a battle over who could make public news and opinion. The state in Britain... I'm going to double the amount of strokes I've had. God. In the early 19th century was a fraction of the size it would assume in the 20th century. Financial penalties through taxation became the mechanism by which the oligarchy sought to control thought. The authorities came to rely increasingly on the newspaper stamp duty and taxes on paper and advertisements as a way of curbing the radical press. The intention of these press taxes was twofold. One, it was to restrict the leadership of newspapers to the well-to-do by raising cover prices, and two, to limit the ownership of newspapers to the propertied class by increasing publishing costs. Those who sold unsanctioned newspapers were jailed. But by 1836, there were more readers of the unsanctioned news than the approved news. The aim of the taxes was to force the newspapers to increase the prices so the lower classes could not afford to buy them and read them out to others. Within a decade, the cover price had gone up by around 400%. Nevertheless, radical, unstamped papers paid no tax, they broke the law, relied heavily upon news reports filed by their readers on a voluntary basis, and had small newsprint costs because of their high readership per copy. Consequently, the radical unstamped newspapers needed to attain only small circulations in order to be economically viable. This influenced the way in which journalists working for the radical press perceived their role. Unlike the institutionalized journalists of the later period, they tended to see themselves as activists rather than as professionals. Oh, that is so woefully ironic. Now look who the real fucking activists are. The institutionalized media like the BBC and Sky News. Or maybe I was right first time. Anyway, hopefully you can already see the comparison with today's starting to emerge. The oligarchy today assert that Tommy Robinson and other citizen journalists... It's like I just know when these things are coming before I even read this shit. Unbelievable. I swear to God, I haven't read this book before. I swear to God. Oh, man. Anyway, the oligarchy today assert that Tommy Robinson and other citizen journalists aren't real journalists. Only those university graduates from rich families Stroke number 7. There we go. I've doubled the number of strokes I've had in one day. Christ. Working for state-sanctioned news media are allowed to be considered as journalists. The leftist analysis of why the oligarchy sought to control the news sheets continues. Movements ranging from early trade unions to political organisations such as the National Union of the Working Classes and the Chartist movement partly depended for their success on the publicity they gained from the radical press. By controlling what the people could say, what they could hear, and what they could think, the oligarchy could prevent the rise of any political views that challenged the way the oligarchy were running the politics and geopolitics of Britain to enrich the wealth and power of the oligarchy. When it came to parliamentary debates on how to control the news sheets, the oligarchy were quite clear about their reasoning. The only question to answer and the only problem to solve is how they, the people, shall read in the best manner how they shall be instructed politically, and have political habits formed the most safe for the constitution of the country. Moreover, we can see that this attitude was also explicitly stated by those members of the oligarchy who were not elected into Parliament. The editor of the first journalist trade journal argued that the great mission of the free press, or a free press rather, was to educate and enlighten those classes whose political knowledge has been hitherto so little, and by consequence so dangerous. The oligarchy were explicitly concerned with finding ways to control political thoughts and actions of the common man. If the common man does not think as the oligarchy want him to think, then he is dangerous. This thought control was sought by both MPs and lords, by both conservative and liberal members of the oligarchy. They were united in seeking to keep the oligarchy's plans and structures in place. We have seen the same thing over the last century in Britain, where even the liberals and the conservatives have been socialists. When seen from this perspective, it's clear why in 1990 the Socialist Party stabbed Thatcher in the back, and why to this day the avowed leftists despise Thatcher as intensely as they despise anyone. For the first time in the 20th century, someone had gained political power who sought to reduce the power of the state. The advertiser-friendly newspapers could have a lower cover price, and given the size of their staff and the revenue they produced, they could manufacture lots of entertaining, apparently non-political content. But all of this content is used to enforce the thought control that suits the oligarchy. The oligarchy found a way to make disinformation and distraction profitable, which means that the system becomes self-perpetuating. The taxes on newspapers were slowly withdrawn from 1833 onwards. The end of the advertisement tax led to cheap press advertising. All competitively priced newspapers became dependent on advertising. Advertisers thus acquired a de facto licensing authority, since without their support, newspapers ceased to be economically viable. As we know from all the recent leftist attempts to get advertisers to boycott businesses that don't follow the catechism of the left, advertising is still used as a form of political censorship. In the 19th century, advertiser-approved newspapers could offer better value for money, in quotes, and would eclipse the small and more political, less entertaining news sheets. The entertainment is the circus of bread and circuses. The fascist state corporate bodies were organised to create advertiser boycotts of the British TV channel GB News, and even against Twitter when it was bought by Elon Musk. You can be sure that there were government-funded agents who were organising these advertiser boycotts of locations of dissent to the fascist state. In the 19th century, it wasn't enough to have those running the oversight organisations of the news agency. Stroke number 8. My God. Organisations of the news industry on board. The oligarchy needed to have the journalists on side as a class of professional propagandists. Some reformers also believed that an expanding capitalist press would raise the pay, status and quality of journalists. Yeah, right. With the clear implication that this would promote moderation and good sense. The establishment of a cheap press. would create a new hierarchical system of communication in which journalists 2 or 3 degrees above the labouring classes would enlighten them. To Gladstone, the principal attraction of repeal of tax restrictions was that it would lead to more men of quality working in the press, and consequently, educating the people. A perfectly free press, rightly commented the journalist J.F. Stephen, is one of the greatest safeguards of peace and order, since journalists belong to the comfortable party of society and will err rather on the side of making too much of their interests rather than that of neglecting them. Thus, a free press is one that the oligarchy controls without appearing to control it through legislation. We will see later that this is the kind of deception the oligarchy in Britain used throughout the 20th century. Moreover, we will see that the oligarchy's concern isn't a commitment to capitalism so much as it is a commitment to power. And from the early years of the 20th century, it is leftism that provided that power, as you will see later with the formation of the BBC, or the British Bullshitting Corporation. British Broadcasting Corporation. Or again, maybe I was right first time. The oligarchy conceived in the 19th century that in making newspapers cheaper to buy, they would price dissenting newspapers out of the market and restore the oligarchy's ability to keep people as free slaves with gramophone minds. The ruthless repression of the unstamped press in the mid-1830s had much the same objective as the campaign which set the press free 20 years later: the subordination of the press to social order. All that had changed was a growing commitment to positive indoctrination of the lower orders through a cheap press, and a growing conviction that free trade and normative controls were a morally preferable and more efficient control system than direct controls administered by the state. This cost-effective indoctrination really took hold in the 20th century with the advent of broadcasting. Moreover, perhaps some of you have already realised that a similar model has been employed with regard to the internet. More on that below. So the analysis by leftist academics is that throughout the 19th century, there was a policy ensuring that only the elite professionals got to be journalists and that only the views of the oligarchy got to be published. Initially, tax laws were used to shut down daily or weekly newspapers critical of the elite. Later, subsidization of media costs through advertising. Then finally, being a journalist became a profession only for those who shared the views of the oligarchy. Journalists became members of the oligarchy, individuals who were able to affect laws, economics, and social policy to a far greater extent than ordinary voters can. Let us now turn to the control of broadcasting in 20th century Britain. The newspaper industry relied on people choosing to part with money on a periodic basis in order for the oligarchy to exert thought control. Broadcasting was entirely different. The thought control is beamed out to all those within reach who have a device that receives a signal, a TV. If the device is on, then the only time the institution's message is not received is if the citizen has switched to another channel. The broadcasting is either propaganda or distraction. Nothing is said that could lead the public to question the oligarchy. The BBC was created as a national state monopoly funded through an annual licence fee, which we can all make do without. Those who had the means to switch on a device capable of receiving the BBC signal had to buy a yearly licence, and this is still the situation today. Failure to have a licence for the device was prosecuted through the criminal courts. This hybrid organisation, neither a nationalised business nor a free market business, was considered preeminently desirable by the oligarchy in 20th century Britain. You might think that this would have been brought into law by the socialism of the Labour Party or the socialism of the Liberal Party, but it was in fact introduced by a law passed in 1927 by a con-socialist government. Now, before I go any further in this, I will just reiterate the points that I've made in the past about TV licensing. So first and foremost, if you watch or record live broadcasts as they are being shown, or you watch anything on BBC iPlayer, so if you watch, broadcast, or record anything live on TV as it's shown, or on watch stuff on BBC iPlayer, you have to have a license. If you don't, watch programs as they are live, or record them as they are live, or watch anything on BBC iPlayer, you categorically do not need a TV license. And any goons that come down to that door to say, I'm from TV licensing, you can safely slam the door in their face and they won't be able to do a fucking thing about it. Never forget that. Now, the BBC is a public corporation, which means that it has a royal charter, like the Bank of England. And up until 1992, all of our universities were created by royal charter. You could see from this status that the BBC plays a special role in how the oligarchy control thought in Britain. Just as the oligarchy control finance and education, so they wanted the same control over entertainment. Entertainment is another means of distracting the masses and keeping us away from the unsanctioned opinions and information. That the BBC should avoid advertising when the advertisement industry has been so successful at suppressing dissent in the 19th century shows that the political framework has shifted drastically to the left by the early 20th century. As soon as the BBC was created, its special status was seen as a possible model for the management of other national services, for which private control or direct state management are equally unsuitable. That is, by 1927, the use of corporations as a third way of business being run with social control was now in operation. By third way, what is meant is that the organisation is neither purely state-owned nor purely privately owned. The legal business status of BBC was modelled on the post office of the 1920s, which was seen by British politicians as the one socialist experiment that now runs well, in air quotes. Thus, in 1927, the BBC was to be a socialist experiment in running a major national business of distraction and indoctrination. But without state ownership, not financed by the state, the Post Office and the BBC were not the only such hybrid organisations in Britain in the 1920s. Public boards, corporations, had all become all the rage. Stroke number 9. Oh, fuck me. Politicians of every creed, when confronted with an industry or a social service which was giving trouble or failing to operate efficiently, created a board. Older readers will remember that even decades after Thatcher's privatised such organisations, some elderly relatives might still refer to the water board, the gas board, the electricity board, etc., etc. The leftist professors go on to state that from the first years of the 20th century, the elite in Britain were in favour of having large important businesses come under government control. A generation of reformers who had been civil servants during the First World War were experienced in organising the centralised distribution of resources. The BBC was formed in this period. So the BBC was created within a decade of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, within a decade of the end of World War I, within a decade of the 1919 Bolshevik Revolution in the German state of Bavaria, and within a decade of Mussolini's socialist command of the Italian state. All these examples of command economies were now the dominant perspective among the oligarchy. So it's little surprise that they want the new broadcasting industry to be run as a command structure of the oligarchy. In the years before the corporation was created in 1927, the BBC had already existed, but as a private company, the British Broadcasting Company. In converting it to a corporation, the government gave it a legal monopoly. The company did not like that the public were evading payment of a radio license by building their own radios. Listeners evaded the tariff by building their own sets. They then evaded the full license by applying for experimental licenses. The oligarchy decided that the corporation should be a government-created monopoly, ensuring no competition to the BBC's entertainment output, and that it should be funded by license, a state-enforced subscription with criminal penalties for non-payment on anyone owning any equipment capable of receiving the programming broadcast by the BBC, which is still a century later the basis for we farmed animals being forced to fund the state propaganda, even if we never watched the BBC propaganda. It was only 3 decades after the BBC was transformed from a company to a corporation that a private broadcaster was allowed to offer competing broadcasts with the BBC. But even a century after the creation of this crypto-fascist stroke number 10, I'm done for. I'm fucked. I'm really fucked. Someone's going to give me a bollocking for this. The crypto-fascist corporation, anyone who owns any equipment capable of receiving broadcasts, is forced by the threat of criminal prosecution to fund the state broadcaster. When it comes to being compelled to fund the state broadcaster, most Brits, like the farmed animals of Orwell's story, tell themselves that they are free. How did academics examining the growth of the mass media interpret the place of the BBC? In our framework as a tool of propaganda, the oligarchy, and I quote, the BBC legitimised its model of broadcasting, not by the huge audience the service soon attracted, but by reference to the elite of the great and the good who trooped into studios to educate and inform on every subject. Shaw's, Wells, the Webbs, Beveridge, Keynes and Huxley. The roll call is endless. All those names were listed were members of the Fabian Society. So a con-socialist government set up a state broadcaster financed by repressive and regressive laws in order to feature a rotating merry-go-round of rich pro-Stalin, pro-genocide elite socialists. The oligarchy want the public to think that Labour and con-socialists are opposites and antagonistic, but it's all just puppet theatre. Punch and Judy springs to mind. The con-socialists created a monopoly in broadcaster indoctrination, which beamed out propaganda by the supporters of Mussolini, Hitler and Stalin. The Sykes Report, which led to the transformation of the BBC from a private company into the BBC as a state broadcaster, stated, we consider such a potential power over public opinion and the life of the nation ought to remain within the state. If you visit YouTube and look at the BBC channel, it says, and I quote, the BBC is the world's leading public service broadcaster. We're impartial. Keep fucking dreaming. Sorry. And independent. And every day we create distinctive, world-class I can't. I'm sorry. I can't. I can't with this shit. World-class programs. Fuck off. Oh dear. And content which inform, educate, and entertain, more like indoctrinate, patronise, and disrespect, millions of people in the UK and around the world. End quote. Fucking hell. Who do the... I want whatever drugs they're smoking right now because they must be fucking good, let me tell you. Oh my God almighty. I am so sorry. No mention of the BBC being a state broadcaster controlled by the great and the good of the oligarchy. They see the public service they do as controlling the thoughts of the public. It's a service for the oligarchy, not for the public. Likewise, on Twitter, there's no mention of the BBC being state propaganda. Even when it looks like the BBC is attacking the government, the BBC is serving the oligarchy and the pretense of that Tweedledee is not the same as his twin brother Tweedledum. Despite the con-socialists pretending for the past 50 years that they were individual freedom and against the nanny state, they have made no attempt to diminish the power of the crypto-fascist state broadcasting corporation which they created a century ago. Whilst we can find no evidence for Orwell stating the Ministry of Truth in 1984 is meant to be the BBC, given the BBC's crypto-fascist nature and the way in which the BBC has been the mouthpiece of Fabian English socialism, from the creation of the corporation, the BBC appears to be a good fit for the Ministry of Truth. In the 1930s, it was clear that the oligarchy regarded the BBC as a branch of the government, even when in its official position was that it was independent. Thus, from the government perspective, a 1936 parliamentary report into broadcasting said, "We have no reason to suppose that in practice divergent views of public interest have been held by the corporation and government departments." So that if it was admitted by Parliament from the first decade of the BBC's existence that, surprise, surprise, the state-controlled BBC and the government share the same view of what is in the interest of us farmed animals, what we farmed animals think is irrelevant. And that, I believe, will be all. Fucking hell. I must admit, I was worried I was going to break the new record of how many strokes I can have in a single video. I mean, I was very close at times. 10 strokes, my God. So we're only 4 days in. I'm having on average 4 strokes a day. Christ. My God. It's more like 4 1/4 strokes, but man alive, what a long one this one's been. 50 minutes, and it's starting to get dark, so this is an adequate time to end this, but thank you all for tuning in. I appreciate you being here. This video will obviously go up first, as said, so that I can get the other one uploaded later down the line, where I talk about Nigel the Phony Farage's backstabbing, of course, and Lee Anderson's backstabbing, and Richard Tice's backstabbing, and basically how Reform have basically made it set in stone that they will never support or welcome in Tommy Robinson. So stay tuned for that. And I will wish you all a good morning, afternoon, or evening. And we will see what page 138's last paragraph onwards. Let's see what that brings as far as information. Because we are going to blow this whole fucking case as far as this traitorous establishment is concerned. We're going to blow the whole case wide open.